Timeless Assassin by author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 1081 to 1096. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And those who want to support me, I have a Patreon channel. Get early access to video on Patreon. Chapter 1081 Return. Planet Granada, Leo's POV. Leo hovered silently above the violent seas of Granada, his breathing uneven as he quietly huffed and puffed, trying to maintain control over his body while the storm raged endlessly beneath him. The waves crashed violently against one another, rising and collapsing in chaotic rhythm, as the dark waters stretched endlessly in every direction, their surface alive with restless motion and hidden force. Yet despite the chaos below, Leo focused on his task. He extended his hand outward and collected the seawater upward in controlled streams, as it flowed into the specialized vessels created by the cult craftsmen, each one designed with precision beyond ordinary workmanship. These containers were not simple storage units. Once sealed, they preserved whatever was placed within them at the exact temperature and pressure at which it had been collected, ensuring that even the most delicate properties remained untouched over time. It was the only way to safely transport something as valuable as the waters of Granada, as whatever secrets these waters held, it would be stupid to lose them over improper storage methods, as even the slightest imbalance could ruin their value entirely. Glop, glop. Minutes passed, and Leo continued collecting. Liters upon liters of water flowed upward, filling vessel after vessel as he worked in silence, his movements steady despite the growing strain within his body. However, even as he stayed completely still, something felt wrong. The victory that he had just secured felt distant, almost meaningless, as the overwhelming pain radiating from his severed finger refused to fade, its presence constant and suffocating. His head felt light. The blood loss had begun to take its toll, as his vision wavered slightly while the storm around him seemed to blur at the edges, the world itself losing clarity. "It's just a finger," Leo muttered under his breath, as he tried to steady himself, forcing his thoughts into something practical, something grounded. "If I get back quickly, the medics might still be able to reattach it," he continued, his voice quieter now, as though trying to convince himself more than anything else. "They can scrape off the affected flesh, remove whatever the origin metal has tainted, and fix the rest." The thought lingered, fragile, uncertain, yet Leo held onto it regardless, as he continued filling the containers, refusing to slow down despite the dizziness slowly spreading in his brain. 5,000 gallons. That was the number he stopped at. It felt sufficient, as anything more was most likely not something the cult would need for the next 2,000 years, as with a controlled motion, he sealed the final vessel. Lock. The mechanism locked instantly, preserving the contents within, as Leo ensured that every container was secured properly before allowing himself to pause for even a second. Then, without wasting another moment, he raised his hand. Slash. The space before him split open. FWOOSH. A dimensional portal formed, its edges shimmering violently against the storm as it stabilized into a passage that led back home. However, just before stepping through, Leo turned once more, his gaze searching for Morris, who still sat not far away at the game table with a smile on his face, as though he had just witnessed something deeply entertaining. "Until next time then, Cult Master," Morris said, as he smiled wider. And although it was one of the most disgusting smiles Leo had ever seen, he still forced himself to smile back as he gave Morris a dry laugh. Ha! A mirthless chuckle escaped him. Not out of humor, but out of sheer exhaustion, as he shook his head faintly before turning away without another word, as he stepped into the portal and left Granada behind. Meanwhile, back inside the time-stilled world, Shadow Number 1's POV. Leo had been gone for only a few minutes, and yet with every passing second, Shadow Number 1 felt his unease deepen, as a quiet anxiety began to coil within his chest. Leo had given him clear orders on what to do if he did not return, and yet, Shadow Number 1 did not know for sure as to what he would do if his lord really died, as his thoughts began to drift toward darker possibilities. If Leo failed to return, the consequences would be catastrophic, as the current cult was far from being stable enough to endure another sudden shift in leadership, as too many pieces were still in motion. Too many plans remained unfinished, as the generational dream of revenge and universal domination relied heavily on Leo's continued existence to move forward without disruption. Without him, everything would slow. Decades of preparation would be forced into delay, as the cult would need to regroup, reorganize, and rebuild its momentum before it could even consider advancing again. And that delay could potentially stretch into centuries, as the thought alone was enough to make Shadow Number 1 flick his tail anxiously behind him. Flick. Flick. I hope the Lord is fine. He muttered, as just as the tension reached its peak, the space beside him suddenly tore open. FWOOSH. A dimensional portal formed nearby, its edges distorting the air around it as Shadow Number One's eyes snapped toward it instantly. Leo stumbled out, his figure unsteady, his breathing uneven, as one hand clutched a severed finger while the other bled freely, crimson dripping steadily onto the ground beneath him. For a brief moment, Shadow Number One's tail wagged in relief. Then it froze. The sight of Leo's injury registered fully, as the initial joy vanished instantly, replaced by sharp concern that overtook his expression without hesitation. Medics, now, Leo ordered, his voice strained yet commanding, cutting through the air with urgency that left no room for delay. Shadow Number One reacted immediately. He pulled out his communication orb and began issuing rapid orders, his voice sharp and controlled as he relayed the emergency to every available medical unit within range. Within moments, movement followed. Footsteps echoed through the halls as a team of medics rushed into the chamber, their expressions focused as they prepared themselves to assess and treat the damage without wasting another second. Meanwhile, within the time-stilled world, Leo's chamber, Leo's POV. The doctors studied Leo's injury for a brief moment, before quickly deliberating amongst one another on the proceeding course of action, as the first priority was to reattach Leo's severed finger as fast as possible. We must restore the connection immediately, one of the younger doctors said, his voice tight with urgency as he reached toward the severed finger with trembling precision. The longer we delay, the lower the chances of successful reintegration, another added, already preparing fine thread sutures and stabilizing seals, his hands moving faster than his thoughts. A senior physician stepped forward, his gaze sharp as he observed both the wound and the finger, as he spoke in a lower tone that carried far more weight. Check the internal condition first, he said quietly, as he extended his hand, stopping them before they could begin the stitching process prematurely. The room fell silent for a brief moment. Then they obeyed. One of them carefully sliced into the base of the severed finger, his blade precise as he exposed the inner tissue, expecting resistance, expecting structure, expecting life. However, surprisingly, he found none. The flesh parted too easily. The nerves did not respond. And although the tissue held shape, it shockingly carried no vitality within it, as though it had been hollowed out from the inside while leaving the surface untouched. This is wrong, the doctor muttered under his breath, his hands stiffening as he stared at what lay before him. Another leaned closer. He inspected the nerve endings, attempting to stimulate them through mana-assisted probing, as a faint glow passed through the structure in search of any lingering nerve signal. However, unfortunately, nothing responded. It's dead, he said slowly, his voice dropping into disbelief. Completely dead. A ripple of unease spread through the group. That's not possible, a younger doctor argued immediately, stepping forward as he refused to accept the conclusion so quickly. There's no visible decay, the structure is intact, we can still attempt reconnection using regenerative weaving. It will fail, the senior physician interrupted firmly, his tone cutting through the rising tension without hesitation. He stepped closer. This is not conventional damage, he continued, as he pointed toward the exposed inner layers, his expression growing more severe with each passing second. Every cell has been neutralized. There is no regenerative response left to anchor onto. Silence followed his words. Still, not all were convinced. We can try a full reconstruction, another doctor insisted, his voice steadier but no less determined, as he began preparing a more complex sequence of restoration sigils. If we rebuild the pathways manually and stimulate them with layered healing magic, we might be able to force a reactivation. And if we fail? The senior asked, his gaze locking onto him, sharp and unwavering. As the younger doctor hesitated. This is the Lord's body, the senior continued, his voice lowering further as the weight of responsibility pressed into every word he spoke. We do not experiment on it when the risk is unknown. Another stepped in. But this is his finger, he argued, his expression tightening as he looked toward Leo briefly before returning his gaze to the wound. We cannot declare it lost without exhausting every possible option. What if there is a method we have not considered yet? He argued, as the room became divided on what to do next. Some nodded in agreement with the younger doctor, their desire to save the finger strong. However, the more experienced doctors remained cautious, their expressions conflicted as they balanced duty against hope, as they understood the consequences of making the wrong call here. No, we are just wasting precious time here, the senior physician said eventually, as he exhaled slowly, his fingers hovering over the wound itself, as he began inspecting the exposed flesh still attached to Leo's hand. His eyes narrowed. There, he said quietly. The others followed his gaze. A faint discoloration, subtle, barely visible unless one knew exactly what to look for, as something within the wound seemed to carry a presence that did not belong. "It's spreading," he said, as the words settled heavily into the room. "That is not ordinary poison," he continued, as his tone hardened, his decision now forming with absolute clarity. "Whatever this origin contamination is, it has already begun permeating the surrounding tissue." A younger doctor took a step back. "Then we have even less time," he said, his earlier confidence beginning to fracture as the situation revealed itself more fully. "Yes, we don't have enough time. So instead of saving a finger, we focus on saving what's already healthy within the Lord first," the senior stated, as everyone bit their lips nervously. "We cut away everything that has come into contact with the blade and cauterize the wound immediately," the senior declared, as many doctors stiffened at that statement. "But senior, that would mean removing even more of his flesh," one said quietly, as the reality of the decision began to sink in. "Yes," the senior replied. "And it will be painful." His gaze shifted briefly toward Leo. "But it's better than endangering the life of the Lord," he said, as he took the lead and leaned in without hesitation, pressing his mouth against the wound and drawing out the blood in forceful pulls before spitting it aside in quick succession. Slurp, spit, slurp, spit. Each cycle grew heavier than the last, as the metallic taste thickened across his tongue, carrying with it a strange, suffocating weight that made his chest tighten with every breath he took. The blood felt wrong. It resisted him, clinging stubbornly to the wound as though it carried a will of its own, as the doctor continued regardless, forcing it out again and again despite the growing dizziness clouding his mind. His vision began to blur. Yet he did not stop. Not until he was certain that the surface contamination had been reduced as much as his body could manage to extract without collapsing entirely under the strain. Only then did he pull away. He staggered slightly, catching himself against the edge of the table as one of the assistants moved forward to support him, his breathing uneven and shallow. "Antiseptic," he ordered, his voice rough but commanding, as he forced his focus back onto the task at hand. A vial was placed into his grasp immediately. Without delay, he uncorked it and poured its contents directly over Leo's wound, as the liquid spread across the exposed flesh, reacting instantly with a faint hiss that filled the room. The smell was sharp, biting, as the solution worked to cleanse whatever remnants remained on the surface, burning away impurities with ruthless efficiency while the doctors watched closely for any abnormal reaction. "Cut deeper," he said next, his tone steadier now despite the fatigue pulling at his senses. "Remove everything that has been touched." There was no hesitation this time. One of the surgeons stepped forward, his blade already prepared, as he positioned himself carefully over Leo's hand before making the first decisive incision. Slice. Flesh parted cleanly. A small section of Leo's palm was removed, as the doctor worked with precise control, ensuring that only the affected areas were taken while preserving as much viable tissue as possible. Another followed immediately after. Then another. Each cut deliberate, measured. As the team worked in silent coordination, their movements synchronized through years of training, their focus absolute as they carved away anything that even hinted at contamination. Leo remained still throughout, his jaw clenched tightly, his breathing controlled through sheer force of will as waves of pain surged through him, each cut sending a fresh spike through his senses. His vision flickered briefly. Darkness threatened to creep in from the edges, yet he held on, anchoring himself through the pain as he refused to lose awareness in the middle of the procedure. "Cauterize," the senior doctor instructed. A heated instrument was brought forward, and without delay, it was pressed against the open wound. *SSSSSs. The sound of searing flesh filled the chamber as the exposed tissue was sealed, the bleeding brought under control as the edges of the wound fused under intense heat. The smell followed immediately after. Thick, acrid, yet no one flinched. This was necessary. Once the bleeding was contained, the next phase began. Fine sutures were threaded through the remaining flesh, as the doctors worked quickly to close the wound, their hands steady despite the intensity of what they had just done. Thread passed through skin, pulled tight, secured. Line by line, the wound was sealed. And then came the final step. Healing magic. A soft glow enveloped Leo's hand, spreading across the stitched flesh as the energy worked to stabilize the damage, accelerating the natural recovery process while reinforcing what remained. The light pulsed gently, then faded. Silence followed. The procedure was complete. The worst of the contamination had been removed. While the spread had been halted for now. Huff puff. Leo's breathing steadied slightly as the throbbing pain dulled into something more manageable, the sharp edge of it fading as clarity slowly returned to his mind. He could feel it. The difference. The absence of that suffocating presence at the wound itself, replaced by a lingering discomfort that no longer threatened to consume him entirely. But it was not gone. Some of it remained. Deep within, microscopic fragments of origin metal that had already entered his bloodstream, far beyond the reach of any blade or spell, as they circulated silently through his body without resistance. The doctors knew it. Leo knew it. Even Shadow Number 1 could see it. They had saved him, they had bought him time, but they had not removed the threat completely. "Forgive us, my lord," the senior doctor said quietly, lowering his gaze slightly as the weight of the outcome settled upon him. The finger could not be restored. Leo looked at his hand, then back at the doctor, as he gave a slow, understanding nod, his expression calm despite everything, as he accepted the result without resistance. They had done what they could, the rest was his fate to bear now. Chapter 1083 Future Discussions. Within the time-stilled world, secure storage yard, Leo's POV. Once the surgery was over and Leo had reported to Amanda that he was back home safe, he wasted no more time, as he called for Ver and chose to meet him inside the secure storage yard, the cult's most fortified treasure facility. The chamber they entered was vast yet tightly controlled, its walls reinforced with layered enchantments and dense alloys, as faint runic patterns pulsed periodically across its surface, silently safeguarding everything stored within. There were no guards present. However, none were needed, as the chamber itself functioned as a fortress, designed to deny intrusion through absolute and unforgiving security measures that left no room for error. At the center of the room, two small metal stools had been placed deliberately, simple in appearance yet purposeful in placement, as Leo took his seat upon one of it with steady composure. His injured hand rested lightly over his knee, wrapped beneath clean layers of tightly bound bandages, which concealed the damage while faint stains of dried blood marked what had been lost. Opposite to him sat Aegon Ver, his facial features currently altered to make him appear as Commander Sparrow, while between them rested a reinforced table, its surface supporting the three ingredients that had cost them dearly to gather. The flower from the eternal garden shimmered faintly within its container, its 5 petals glowing with a soft, unnatural radiance that hinted at its divine origin. The water from Granada remained sealed within pressurized vessels, its surface glowing with a mysterious purple glow when viewed under UV light. While the soil from the pit lay beside them, dark red and dense, carrying with it a heavy presence that smelled like battlefield and death. Leo's gaze moved slowly across each of the items, measured and deliberate, as though acknowledging both their value and the cost behind them before lifting toward Ver, as the two made eye contact. For a brief moment, they studied one another, until eventually, Ver lowered his eyes towards Leo's bandaged palm, where the absence of a finger spoke louder than anything else. "So you sacrificed a finger for these waters? Cuz?" Ver asked, as Leo let out a short chuckle in response. "Yeah, I got off easy compared to what you suffered to get the flower," Leo said, as Ver smiled at that. The entire cult had suffered greatly to bring Ver back from the pit, and in a way, Soren himself had sacrificed his life to ensure that Ver survived. So, when factoring it all in, the cost to gather these 3 ingredients had indeed been exponential. "I think we have enough soil and water to make dozens of demigod potions for the cult in the future. So, if presented with the right opportunity, we can trade it to other partners in exchange for what we need. However, the constraint right now is the moonshine flower. 5 petals means we can make 5 breakthrough potions at best, if none of the brewing procedures fail." Ver shared, as Leo nodded in understanding. Unlike Monarch and Transcendent tier breakthrough potions which needed to be brewed and used fresh after brewing for maximum efficiency, the demigod breakthrough potion had no such constraint. A demigod breakthrough potion could safely be stored for even half a millennia without losing potency, which was why, the question was not how to preserve it, but rather who to award it to. 5 potions. I take 1. You take 1. I save 2 for my kids. That leaves us with 1. Ideally, I want to hand it over to my nephew Leonardo, but I'm not sure how you would feel about that, Leo said, as Ver shook his head from side to side. "No need to allocate me 1, Cult Master. If we go about it like this, then the senior fighters of the cult will feel like their contributions aren't being rewarded properly, so I suggest an alternative," Ver said, as Leo listened to his proposal with open ears. "You take the 3 you need for yourself and your family. No questions asked. However, as for the other 2, announce an open tournament between all Monarch commanders who wish to claim it, and make it a spectacle." Ver began, as his eyes glowed with ferocity. 2 winners will get their hands on the demigod breakthrough potion. The 2 strongest and best fighters of the cult, who deserve getting a shot at breaking through. I have faith in my own abilities to compete as Commander Sparrow and winning. However, even if I don't, I will have no regrets, since then I did not deserve to break through. Anyway, he explained, as he continued to maintain eye contact with Leo. Same goes for your nephew. If he really has the goods, he'll win. If not, he can't complain because he had a fair opportunity to get it. Just like everyone else. Ver concluded, as Leo thought about it for a while before nodding. It had indeed been a long time since the cult last saw a grand event where all of its strongest fighters participated, so this could indeed prove to be a good morale booster for the populace. And to add to that, the tournament may even incentivize the lower ranks to work harder so that someday even they could get a chance to compete for the demigod potion, which could bring about a positive culture within the cult. I respect your choice, cuz it seems like you have matured a lot during your time here as Commander Sparrow. And so, I will indeed do as the dragon wishes, Leo said, as he bowed his head slightly in respect, with Ver reciprocating almost instantly, as the two showed one another appropriate courtesy. The potion masters will need somewhere between 7 to 14 days to craft these potions. And then, there's the matter of me breaking through as well. So, all things considered, the tournament will be a month from now. The official announcement will be made sometime this week. So do your best to come prepared, Leo informed, as Ver nodded in understanding. XXXXXX. End of Volume 9. A New Era of Chaos. See you all in the last and final volume of the book. Volume 10. The Cycle of History. Chapter 1084 The Skyshard Name. Timeless Assassin. Volume 10. The Cycle of History. Time does not progress in a straight line. It turns, again and again, as though bound to an unseen rhythm that governs the rise and fall of all things. As civilizations are built, prosper, decay, and are reduced to dust before the cycle quietly begins anew. Hardship gives rise to strength, as those forced to endure suffering learn to sharpen their will, temper their resolve, and carve order out of chaos through blood, sacrifice, and unrelenting persistence. Strength, in turn, creates prosperity, as the world bends beneath those capable of shaping it, allowing peace to take root in the absence of immediate danger. Yet prosperity carries within it the seed of its own destruction, as comfort dulls the edge of discipline, and discipline, once eroded, gives way to weakness that cannot withstand the inevitable return of hardship. And so, the cycle continues. In such a world, the line between good and evil was never fixed. Those who are praised as righteous in one era may be condemned in the next, as the same actions that once brought order may later be judged as tyranny when seen through the lens of a different age. And those who are feared as villains may, with time, be remembered as necessary forces that shaped the world into what it needed to become. Because history does not preserve truth. It preserves outcomes. And as long as the wheel continues to turn, it will not matter who was right, and who was wrong. Only who remained standing when the dust finally settled. Raj_Shah_ 7152, Timeless Assassin Volume 10, Chapter 1084. Cult Military Grounds, outskirts of Skyshard City. Caleb's paw. Caleb sat quietly among his fellow lieutenants, his posture relaxed on the surface, as for what felt like the dozenth time that afternoon, the conversation drifted back toward his father once again. Did you hear? The Lord has announced a tournament for all cult monarchs, where the winner and runners-up are going to receive a demigod breakthrough potion each, one of them said excitedly, his eyes lighting up as the news spread. Only Lord Skyshard can give away something so valuable so casually, two common soldiers being elevated like that. I don't even remember if Lord Soren ever handed out a demigod potion so freely, another added, his voice filled with admiration. Lord Skyshard is simply the best. If I ever get the chance to shake his hand, it will be the greatest honor of my life, a third said, as his tone carried a reverence that bordered dangerously close to worship. Caleb listened. He had heard variations of this countless times before, as grown men spoke of his father with an almost sacred awe, their words filled with admiration that extended far beyond respect and into something deeper. Within the cult, Leo Skyshard was more than just a leader, as to many, he represented something absolute, a figure whose decisions were rarely questioned and whose actions were accepted as inherently correct. And while Caleb did enjoy hearing the stories of his father's past exploits, as they were undoubtedly legendary tales that inspired common soldiers to be brave and never back down in the face of adversity, the atmosphere around him always shifted by the end of it. Because when the eyes of his colleagues eventually turned toward him, he could clearly see the expectation reflected within them, as they silently hoped that he too would one day rise to achieve a similar kind of glory for the cult. And it was in those moments that Caleb found himself growing uncomfortable, as having witnessed fragments of his father's true strength firsthand, he understood the vast and almost immeasurable distance that separated his father from every other warrior. A distance that, even now, he could not see himself, or anyone else for that matter, ever truly bridging. When he was younger, this had never stood out to him, as the world had been smaller then, limited to moments where he was simply a son rather than a name tied to something far greater. However, as he grew older and stepped further into the reality of the cult, he began to see the weight attached to the Skyshard name, as it followed him into every interaction, every decision, and every expectation placed upon him. Even as a lieutenant, his treatment differed subtly from the others, as commanders consulted him more carefully, as criticism toward him carried restraint, and as opportunities seemed to present themselves more readily than they did for others. It was not favoritism in its most obvious form, yet it existed in the quiet adjustments people made around him, shaped by the identity he carried whether he wished for it or not. And with that identity came expectation. An unspoken belief that he would rise, that he would excel, that he would one day stand beside his father not as a shadow, but as an equal forged from the same legacy. And while Caleb did not reject that expectation, he could not bring himself to fully embrace it either, as deep within, he understood the distance between who he was and who the world expected him to become. Because being born a Skyshard did not grant him his father's strength. Nor did it grant him the certainty that he could ever reach those heights, no matter how much others believed that he would. It only placed him beneath a shadow that stretched endlessly ahead, as every step forward felt measured against a standard he had never chosen for himself. He rarely spoke of it. Neither did Myron. Yet between the two of them, there existed a quiet understanding, as they alone truly grasped what it meant to carry a name that the world had already decided the meaning of. Are you going to participate in this tournament? Caleb, they say, by the time he was a transcendent, Lord Skyshard could already defeat a dozen monarchs alone. Someone said, as Caleb turned and gave the lieutenant a blank look, as though questioning whether his words made sense even to himself, before eventually shaking his head, as he said, the rules clearly say you have to be a commander to take part. And last I checked, I'm not a commander. Chapter 1085 The Demigod Breakthrough Potion. Brewing Chamber 1, The Time-Stilled World. Brahim's path. Brewing a demigod breakthrough potion was something every supreme potion master dreamed of across the span of their entire life. And yet, because of how absurdly rare the ingredients required to make one truly were, many masters had gone to their graves without ever getting the chance to attempt it even once. Which was why, when Leo personally contacted him and informed him that he would be making not just one, but 5 complete vials of demigod breakthrough potions, Brahim felt as though the purpose of his entire existence had suddenly crystallized into one clear moment. For several breaths after hearing the order, he had simply stood there in silence, his old hands trembling faintly while his mind struggled to fully grasp the scale of what had just been entrusted to him, as even for a man of his standing, such an opportunity bordered on the divine. The method to brew a demigod potion had been entrusted to him by his master, like his master had given him before that, and yet, no one in the past 7 generations of his masters had ever had the chance to actually brew one, as the ingredients were just that rare. This is the greatest day of my life, Brahim said, as once the shock faded, he moved immediately. He summoned every supreme potion master currently available within the cult's territory, and ordered them to gather their most trusted apprentices beneath them, as he began preparing his laboratory with a severity that left absolutely no room for carelessness, compromise, or hidden imperfection. Other than the 3 main ingredients that Leo himself had secured at immeasurable cost, Brahim personally went out and acquired every single auxiliary herb, catalyst, stabilizer, and reactive mineral needed for the complete formula, as he refused to entrust even one insignificant component to anyone else's judgment. He checked every ingredient once. Then again. Then a third time, as weight, age, purity, moisture content, monosaturation, and even the faintest traces of contamination were measured with obsessive precision, while anything less than ideal was discarded without hesitation regardless of expense. His laboratory underwent the same treatment. Every old vessel that had even the faintest possibility of retaining past impurities was thrown out, every stirring rod and titration funnel replaced, every cauldron scrubbed down and then replaced anyway, while the entire chamber was sterilized from end to end through fire cleansing, alchemical vapor purification, and layered magic filters. By the time all of it was done, the chamber no longer resembled the lived-in workplace of a veteran master, but rather a sacred site prepared for a ritual that could not afford to fail even once, as the air itself smelled sharp, clean, and completely odorless. Then, when everything had been laid out and every participant stood in position with their tools, ingredients, and assigned roles memorized down to the second, Brahim finally addressed them. Gentlemen, what we are about to attempt today must have no mistakes whatsoever, Brahim said, his voice calm yet carrying enough weight to make even the youngest apprentice hold his breath. I cannot overstate how important this is, nor what the consequences of failure would be. I am certain all of you already understand, so let us do our best, he said, as dozens of heads lowered in solemn acknowledgement before the brewing process finally began. At the center of the room sat the main transmutation cauldron, forged from triple refined star iron and silver-veined obsidian, its inner walls etched with stabilizing runes that shimmered faintly whenever mana brushed against them, while 6 smaller support vessels surrounded it in a perfect circle. The first stage involved purification of the granada water. One assistant carefully uncorked the pressurized vessel while 3 others immediately stabilized the ambient pressure around the pouring station, as even the slightest fluctuation risked altering the water's composition in a way that could later throw off the potion's balance. The water itself entered the receiving basin in a slow, controlled stream, unnaturally dense and faintly luminous under alchemical lamps, as Brahim watched the surface carefully for any reaction while a pair of apprentices began whispering invocation chants to bind low-grade water spirits into the purification array. The spirits were not summoned for power, but for sensitivity. Their task was to detect instability within the liquid, guiding the filtration crystals toward any subtle irregularities invisible even to trained human senses, as the water passed through 6 successive membranes before finally entering the primary cauldron. Once the base medium had been prepared, the heating phase began. No ordinary flame was used. Instead, Brahim called forth 3 contracted fire spirits, each one tethered through ruby channels embedded in the floor, as their narrow streams of spiritual flame licked the underside of the cauldron with astonishing consistency while thermometer wards tracked the rise in heat to the smallest degree. "Hold it there," Brahim murmured, his fingers hovering over the measurement runes as the water reached the first threshold, where ordinary herbs would have been added in lesser brews, but where this formula instead demanded powdered soulroot, voidmint essence, and 2 drops of dragon marrow suspension to prepare the liquid to receive divinity-grade matter. Each ingredient was introduced in sequence, never together, as one apprentice ground the soulroot into a finer dust mid-process while another diluted the marrow suspension through a spiraled titration rig so that the viscosity of the mixture remained stable. The cauldron began to bubble then, but not violently. The sound was tight, rhythmic, controlled, as if the liquid itself were breathing beneath the surface while Brahim adjusted stirring speed with one hand and rune pressure with the other, his eyes never leaving the changing color of the brew. When the mixture darkened from silver blue to deep moonlit violet, he knew the first critical phase had succeeded. As only then did he allow the eternal garden's moonlight flower to be brought forward. Even sealed within its preservation vessel, the flower seemed to alter the atmosphere around it, as its 5 petals gave off a faint radiance that softened the chamber's harsh light and made several apprentices instinctively lower their eyes in reverence. Brahim did not indulge the moment. He cut one petal free with a sanctified crystal blade, then passed it through a mana sieve to separate its outer luminance from its nectar-rich core, as each portion had to be added at different times to avoid overstimulating the base medium. The first fraction dissolved instantly. The second resisted, and when the nectar core finally entered the cauldron, the entire brew convulsed. Bloop, bloop, asterisk fwoosh. For 3 terrifying seconds, the liquid surged upward as though trying to escape its vessel, its surface warping under opposing elemental pressures while the fire spirits shrieked in agitation and one of the pressure wards nearly cracked under the force. "Stabilize it," Brahim barked, as 2 supreme masters immediately stepped in from either side, one cooling the upper layer with mist thread alchemy while the other fed a measured pulse of calming mana through the cauldron's core sigils. Slowly, the reaction settled. The bubbling softened, the color brightened, and the brew entered the second major phase alive. Now came the pit soil. Unlike the flour, the soil could not simply be added. It first had to be burned, reduced, dissolved, strained, and then partially re-solidified into a suspension paste, as its death-saturated density would otherwise poison the structure of the potion before the flour's divinity had time to fully bind with it. This process alone took nearly 3 hours. Every few minutes, Brahim checked consistency with a glass rod, lifted droplets into the light, adjusted thickness with burial salts, and demanded recalibration of heat from the fire spirits, while the apprentices around him ran samples through resonance plates to ensure the balance between life essence, death essence, and transcendental pressure remained intact. By the time the pit suspension finally entered the main cauldron, everyone in the room was sweating. No one dared relax. The final stage was slower than all the rest. For the next several hours, the brew was reduced drop by drop, stirred in alternating directions according to an ancient sequence Brahim had memorized as a boy, then cooled, reheated, diluted, concentrated, and infused with 3 final catalysts until its unstable brilliance gradually began to condense inward. The bubbling ceased first, then the glow softened, then the scent changed. A deep, ancient fragrance rose from the cauldron, one that carried vitality, pressure, and danger in equal measure, as the liquid within settled into a dense golden violet color unlike anything any of the apprentices had ever seen before. Brahim approached the vessel alone for the last step. With both hands steady, he lifted the decanting funnel and began pouring the finished brew into its containment phial, every drop passing through a final rune filter before settling into the bottle with a slow, heavy brilliance. When the last drop fell, the room remained silent for one long second. Then Brahim looked at it and smiled. "It's done," he whispered, as though afraid that saying it too loudly might somehow undo the miracle they had just forced into existence. Cheers. The chamber erupted. Relief, joy, and disbelief poured out of everyone at once. As apprentices embraced, senior masters exhaled like men who had just survived war, and Brahim himself sat down heavily upon the nearest stool while laughing under his breath, too exhausted to celebrate properly yet too fulfilled to remain still. One demigod breakthrough potion now rested before them, perfect and with over a 99.4% purity score. And though the celebration was genuine, everyone in the room understood that the task wasn't finished yet, because this was just one vial, while the Lord needed 5. Chapter 1086. The next stage. The time-stilled world, Leo's POV. Over the past 5 days, while the Supreme Potion Masters labored endlessly to refine the first demigod breakthrough potion, Leo remained within his personal chambers, as he tried to recover to peak condition before attempting the breakthrough. Yet, despite the rest he had given his body, something within him continued to shift in a way that felt deeply unsettling, as a faint lethargy began to creep into his limbs, that refused to fade no matter how much he rested. "What is this weakness that I'm feeling? It feels like the sort of tiredness that comes after a long stint of suffering from a common cold, and yet I haven't been sick in years," he muttered, as he felt as though his body moved just slightly out of sync with itself, like a man recovering from illness who could stand and walk, yet knew instinctively that he was far from his peak condition. "Just 5 days," he murmured under his breath, as his voice carried a faint weight of realization while he flexed his fingers slowly, feeling the subtle resistance in motion that was not there before. "The origin poison has already begun deteriorating my body at a measurable rate," he continued, his gaze lowering toward his bandaged hand as the memory of the wound surfaced with quiet sharpness. "At this stage, it does not interfere with my combat output or physical capabilities, yet there is a clear decline in my baseline condition, as I can no longer say with certainty that I am operating at full capacity." His thoughts deepened. If this continues for a month, the degradation will no longer remain internal, he reflected, as the projection of future outcomes formed naturally within his mind. There will be visible decay, and with it, a tangible loss in performance, he concluded, as his jaw tightened faintly while he processed the inevitability of that path. The conclusion was simple. Ascension was no longer a choice driven by ambition. It had become a necessity driven by survival. And so, when the message finally arrived that the first demigod breakthrough potion was successfully completed, Leo did not hesitate even for a moment before deciding his next course of action. He scheduled his breakthrough for the very next day, choosing Multhorak's floating island as the site, as its isolation and structural integrity made it the most suitable place for what lay ahead. The island floated high above the endless seas of the time-stilled world, far removed from the nearest civilization, where no external disturbance could reach him even if something went wrong. More importantly, it was formed from ancient materials and reinforced through forgotten techniques, granting it the ability to withstand the pressure of a demigod aura, making it the most stable foundation he could rely upon. He traveled there alone, informing Leonardo to remain on standby, as other than him, his nephew was the only one capable of stepping foot onto that island without being overwhelmed by its environment. However, he made it explicitly clear that there was to be no interference unless he called for it, as he did not want even the slightest disruption affecting his breakthrough process. Upon arrival, he did not act immediately. Instead, he sat down upon the cold surface of the island, his posture steady as he closed his eyes and began regulating his breathing, allowing his mind to settle into a state of complete clarity before attempting what lay ahead. Minutes passed, as the wind moved quietly across the island, brushing past him without resistance while the surrounding silence deepened, creating an environment where even the faintest fluctuation in thought could be observed and corrected. He allowed everything unnecessary to fall away, as distraction, expectation, and even fear slowly loosened their hold over his mind until what remained was focus, pure and unwavering. He understood the risks. The mortality rate for ascending into the demigod realm was notoriously high, as countless monarchs throughout history attempted the breakthrough only to fail, their bodies collapsing under the strain of transformation that demanded more than what they could give. Yet as Leo sat there, preparing himself for that very same trial, he found that fear did not take root within him in the way it did for others, as a deep belief in his own destiny anchored his resolve with quiet certainty. It was neither arrogance nor ignorance of the danger, but rather a calm understanding that this was a step he was always meant to take, one that no force would be able to deny him. That certainty had followed him for as long as he could remember, remaining constant through every battle, every hardship, and every moment where failure should have been a possibility. He did not believe he would succeed. He knew it, because if there had ever been a moment in his life where he could have faltered, it would have been long before this point, long before he reached a stage where the path ahead demanded nothing more than him showing resolve, and the fact that he got here was proof enough for him that this was not where his story was meant to end. "All right, let's do this," Leo muttered, as he opened his eyes. The golden vial rested within his hand, its contents shimmering faintly as the dense liquid within radiated a powerful mana signature that revealed the immense energy compressed within it. He studied it for a brief moment, as he exhaled slowly, releasing the final trace of tension from his body before committing to the path ahead. Then, without another thought, he uncorked the vial. Plop! And drank its contents in one smooth motion. Gulp! Gulp! The liquid ran down his throat, as a searing warmth erupted within his chest and spread rapidly through his veins, flooding every corner of his body with violent intensity, as his heartbeat thundered and his senses sharpened unnaturally, while something deep within him began to shift, as though his very existence was being forcefully rewritten from its core. Chapter 1087 Breaking Through. Multhorax Floating Island, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. Gulp gulp. The liquid ran down his throat smoothly, as a violent surge of energy erupted within his chest and spread rapidly through his veins, flooding every corner of his body with an overwhelming pressure that made it feel as though his entire being had been pushed far beyond its natural limits. Within a single breath, his mana circuits overloaded. At the Monarch tier, his mana circuits were no longer separate pathways, as they had already fused with his nervous system and circulatory network, which meant that every cell within his body now pulsed with raw mana as the excess energy had nowhere to disperse. Pupils dilating. Leo felt his eyes stretch open, as his muscles tensed involuntarily while his heartbeat surged violently, each pulse sending waves of unstable energy crashing through him with increasing intensity. "It's too much," he muttered under his breath, as he clenched his fists tightly, trying to contain the overwhelming surge that threatened to tear through his body from within. However, he soon realized that it was impossible to stabilize the pressure through willpower alone, as it continued to rise within him violently. "Yep, this potion is the real deal," he muttered, as in that moment, he understood exactly what needed to be done, as without hesitation, he moved. Whoosh! His body vanished from its seated position as he stepped forward and unleashed his first strike into the empty sky, his arm cutting through space as the force behind it detonated outward in a deafening explosion. Boom! The shockwave rippled across the heavens, splitting the clouds above as the ocean below responded with violent disturbance, waves rising unnaturally as the pressure carried downward from the floating island. Leo did not stop. He struck again, and again, each movement faster than the last, as his body blurred through motion while he unleashed a relentless barrage of attacks into the sky, each one carrying enough force to send tremors through the island beneath his feet. Crown Fall. The named strike descended with overwhelming force, as the compressed energy within his swing erupted outward, tearing through the air and sending a cascading pressure wave that rippled across the entire time-stilled world's upper atmosphere. Tremble. Sonic boom. The island trembled. The seas below roared. Sonic booms echoed endlessly across the horizon as the excess mana continued to pour out of him through destruction, each attack serving as a release valve for the unbearable pressure building within his body. Yet even as he expelled the energy outward, the transformation within him had already begun. Deep within his body, at a level far beyond conscious perception, the structure of his cells started to shift, as the very foundation of his existence began to evolve under the influence of the potion. Where once his cells relied entirely on mana to sustain their function, a new force now began to take its place, as his cells now got their first taste of divine essence. At first, it appeared as faint traces, subtle and almost insignificant, as it began to replace the mana within individual cells, stabilizing their structure while anchoring them into a far more permanent state of existence. Before then spreading, as more and more of his cells transitioned from mana dependency to divine sustenance. This insane strength. Is this what demigod tier feels like? He wondered as his body began to feel lighter, stronger, and more stable, as though the chaos that once defined his internal energy was being replaced by something far more refined. Yet the process was not gentle. The transition demanded balance, as the excess mana still needed to be expelled before the divine essence could fully take hold, which forced Leo to continue his relentless assault upon the sky without pause. Boom, boom, whiplash. His strikes grew heavier and more devastating, each movement now carrying with it a power surge that had not been present moments before, as the wild surge of energy slowly began to refine itself into something deeper and more divine. Swoosh, swoosh, the trembling of the island lessened. The chaos within his body eased. And for the first time since drinking the potion, Leo felt a sense of control returning to him as his breathing steadied and his heartbeat slowed. Yet, the process wasn't quite finished yet, as the transformation continued. The divine essence spread through his body, stabilizing his cells and removing their dependence on external mana, as the slow decay that had once governed his limits began to lose its hold while a deeper, permanent strength settled into him. As the last traces of mana exited his cells, Leo felt a definitive shift take hold within his body, as he felt a strange sense of confidence boom within him that wasn't there before. A confidence that said his bones would not crack no matter how much force he chose to exert, as the structure holding him together now felt absolute, unyielding to strain in a way that no longer resembled anything mortal. A confidence that said he could bend and push his muscles as far as he desired without consequence, as they stretched and contracted with perfect response, returning to form without damage or fatigue. A confidence that said he could channel any amount of mana through his body without fear of overload, as the pathways that once carried limits now felt vast and accommodating, no longer resisting the pressure of power. As that certainty settled within him, Leo understood that what had changed was not simply the strength he possessed, but the very quality of his constitution, as his body had transitioned into something fundamentally more stable and complete. The weakness that once lingered beneath even his greatest efforts had disappeared, replaced by a form that no longer operated under the same fragile constraints, as the balance between power and endurance no longer felt like something he needed to manage. It simply existed. And as Leo stood there in silence, he realized that this was what it meant to step beyond mortality, as his body no longer felt like something that could fail under pressure, but rather something that would endure regardless of it. As finally, he had become a demigod. Chapter 1088 Realm Difference. Multhorak's floating island, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. Once the transformation settled completely, Leo remained still for several moments, as he allowed the changes within his body to stabilize while he slowly grasped the changes within his new constitution. Inhale. Drawing in a sharp breath, he tried to understand the magnitude of difference between now versus when he was a mortal, and what he found shocked even him. The power within me, it feels boundless. Leo muttered, as he felt like there was no bottom to his stamina anymore, and no limit to his power output. It's like, I can now use even the most destructive moves that would destroy my constitution as a monarch without any repercussions. Leo analyzed, as he felt like the same moves that needed life essence for him to perform at the monarch stage now became a new natural baseline for him at the demigod stage, as the divine essence within his cells now made that same output feel effortless. Clench. Unclench. As he clenched and unclenched his fist slowly, he could see how the air around it compressed faintly under the sheer density of force contained within even such a simple motion, as he understood immediately that this was not just an increase in strength, but rather a complete elevation of what his body considered normal output. However, as immense as that realization was, it was not the most important change that occurred within him after stepping into the demigod realm. As something much more important happened, in terms of how he could now interact with the space around him. Are those spatial thinning points? Leo wondered, as looking around, he began to notice subtle distortions scattered throughout the world that had never been visible before. At first, everything appeared unchanged, as the island and the sky remained the same, yet beneath that surface, thin fluctuations stretched across space itself. These distortions appeared like faint folds in the fabric of reality, shifting and stabilizing in patterns that could not be perceived by any mortal being, and yet to Leo, they were now as clear as day. At the monarch tier, he had relied on his aura sense to detect such weaknesses in space, as he used them to force his way through dimensional barriers. However, now, he no longer needed to search, as the pathways between dimensions were clearly visible to him, with the structure of space now exposed to his eyes. Interesting, Leo muttered, as he stood up slowly, his gaze sweeping across the horizon, as he took in the countless points where space thinned and folded into itself naturally. For several moments, he simply observed, allowing this new perception to settle into his awareness without rushing forward or acting impulsively. Then, once he understood enough, he stepped forward toward one such distortion and used an aura dagger to slice it open, as he stepped through it without resistance. FWOOSH. The world around him shifted as darkness enveloped his vision, yet this time, the fourth dimension did not feel empty or void-like. As a mortal, whenever he entered the fourth dimension, he could see nothing beside complete darkness, as he had to rely on muscle memory to chart his path forward. However, now, even within the darkness, he could see countless flowing streams stretching endlessly through space, which moved like currents that responded subtly to his presence. Oh, Leo muttered as he observed these streams carefully, watching how they curved and shifted while maintaining a structure that was now visible to him, before then reaching out slowly for them. As the moment his fingers moved toward one of the streams, it reacted by bending slightly toward him. *BZZT. The divine essence within his body resonated with the currents around him, creating a faint connection that allowed him to interact with them directly. Pull. As he tugged on the stream, it now shifted more noticeably under his influence, as the surrounding space responded with subtle distortions. Ripple. It was not a violent reaction, but it was real, as the dimension itself adjusted slightly in response to his action. What? Leo's eyes sharpened as he processed this change, understanding that he was no longer merely observing the laws of the universe but beginning to interact with them. Before this, he could only theorize and study these concepts through limited perception, unable to directly influence the structure of space itself. However, now, as a demigod, he had taken the first step into a realm where those same laws could be touched and gradually controlled. He lowered his hand slowly, as the realization settled within him that this was the foundation required to challenge beings that existed beyond mortality. This is it, the power I needed to take on gods, Leo muttered, as his voice carried with it an excitement that was missing ever since Soren had died, as finally, he found himself being capable of taking on the divine. However, although these discoveries were all exciting, he did not linger within the fourth dimension for too long, as he understood that further exploration required control, patience, and deeper understanding. FWOOSH. With a single step, he exited the dimension and returned to the floating island, as the familiar world reformed around him seamlessly. The wind brushed past him once again, and the ocean stretched endlessly below, yet everything now felt different despite appearing the same. Leo stood there for a brief moment, as he allowed both layers of perception to settle within him, adjusting to this new state of existence. Then, finally, he sat down upon the cold surface of the island, as he closed his eyes briefly and began organizing his thoughts. The breakthrough was complete, yet what lay ahead was far greater, as this was only the beginning of what he could now achieve. This is but the start. However, now that I am a demigod, I need to craft a new style of battle that can help me take on gods. A style of battle that relies on the laws of the universe. And once I do, I can finally avenge the fall of Ixtal. Leo muttered, as he remained focused on his goals ahead. Chapter 1089 The Skyshards. Meanwhile, dozens of kilometers from Multhorak's floating island, Leonardo's POV. While Leo struggled to break through, a few dozen kilometers away, the only backup that he had brought in case things went wrong, Leonardo watched as the entire world around him trembled under his uncle's power. Boom, boom, kaboom. Even from this distance, the scale of what was unfolding before him became impossible to ignore, as waves surged violently across the ocean below while the winds themselves twisted unnaturally in response to each attack. Skadoosh. The sky split again, a streak of force carved through the heavens, as the clouds above were torn apart in a single motion, leaving behind a vacuum that collapsed moments later. Leonardo's eyes narrowed slightly, as he felt the delayed impact of that strike reach him even from kilometers away, the air trembling faintly around his body. Uncle, he muttered softly, as the weight behind that single attack lingered in his mind, refusing to fade even as the next one followed shortly after. Another strike, then another, each one heavier than the last, as the island beneath Leo trembled under the continuous release of power, while the surrounding seas rose and fell in violent rhythm. Leonardo did not move, he simply watched as the sky was torn apart repeatedly. Watched as the ocean responded like a living entity to the pressure being forced upon it. Watched as the man he called uncle stood at the center of it all, without wavering even once, and in that moment, a quiet realization settled within him. This was the difference. The difference between someone strong and someone who stood at the peak of existence, as although they were both peak monarchs, Leonardo knew that he could not produce even half the strength his uncle could. Sigh. Leonardo exhaled slowly, as he clenched his fist subconsciously while his gaze remained locked onto the distant figure with longing. Through the years, he had often sparred with his uncle, but back then, he always felt as though Leo was holding back. As never in his entire life had Leonardo ever glimpsed at Leo's true strength. However, today, witnessing it from afar, without being caught in the chaos himself, allowed him to understand just how vast that gap really was. This is not something one can bridge through talent alone, or something that can be rectified given enough time. There is not much room for me to improve at the monarch stage. Anymore. Which means, I can probably never be as strong as him at the same tier. Leonardo concluded, as he very reasonably realized the limits of his own foundation. And yet, even though he knew he could never be as good as his uncle at the same tier, it did not suppress his desire to grow stronger, as instead, it made him want to jump tiers even more. The tournament you have hosted. I will be one of its winners. Uncle, I promise. You do your best to break through today, and later this month, I'll make you proud by winning a potion for the family. Leonardo resolved, as he swore to train as hard as necessary to win the upcoming tournament that would give 2 demigod breakthrough potions to its finalists. Meanwhile, the Skyshard residence, Amanda's POV. Click. Sizzle. While Leo broke through on Multhorax Island, Amanda tinkered on a new project within the basement of the Skyshard residence, when suddenly, arg, a loud scream echoed from 2 floors above, breaking her focus. Huh, Amanda wondered, raising an eyebrow, as she placed her tools down with deliberate calm, already recognizing the voice behind the chaos. Thumb. The entire house trembled faintly in the next instant, as though something heavy had been slammed into the ground without restraint. Myron, she muttered under her breath, as she pushed herself up from her seat and began making her way toward the stairs without delay. Her pace quickened as she ascended through the floors, as another muffled thud echoed faintly from above, confirming her suspicion before she even arrived. By the time she reached the first floor, the scene unfolded exactly as expected. Myron sat in the middle of the room, locked in a full struggle with his meditation manual. I'll rip this stupid book apart limb for limb, he shouted, as he shook it violently in his hands, his expression filled with frustration as though the book was his worst enemy. What do you mean the red aura I just observed is not it? What do you mean I now have to understand the difference between different shades of red? What the hell does that even mean? His voice rose with every question, as his grip tightened further while he glared at the pages like they were deliberately mocking him. Do you know how long it took me just to see red? My dad just announced this huge tournament, damn it. I really want to take part. I need to become a monarch tomorrow. Not 99 years later. He complained, as his face grew more and more red with each statement. I'll eat you alive, stupid book, he declared next, as with that, in an act that completely abandoned all dignity, he leaned forward, and bit the book. Bite. Smack. Amanda's hand landed cleanly against the back of his head, the sound sharp as his entire body froze mid-bite. Bad Myron, she said firmly, as though scolding an unruly dog rather than a future powerhouse of the cult, as Myron paused and slowly turned to look up at her. M1. He said with the book still in his mouth, as his expression changed. Instantly, his eyes softened, watering slightly, as his entire demeanor shifted into something pitiful and disarming. Amanda paused. Her stern expression faltered for a brief moment, as she let out a quiet sigh while her frustration melted faster than she would have liked. Studying aura requires patience, she said, her voice calmer now as she placed her hand gently over his head. It's not something you can rush just because you want results. Immediately, Myron sniffed lightly, his grip loosening as he looked at her, though the frustration still lingered beneath the surface. And no, you're too young for the tournament, Amanda continued, as she gently patted his head while maintaining eye contact. So you can stop thinking about it for now. His eyes widened slightly, as the words hit him harder than the earlier smack, his lips parting as though he wanted to argue. Your time will come, Myron, she added, her tone softening further as she ruffled his hair gently. But until then, cultivate patience first. With that, she turned and began to walk away, leaving him behind, with the manual still clutched in his hands. For a moment, silence returned. Then, Myron's grip tightened again. The book trembled slightly in his hands, as his expression darkened, while he prepared to resume his earlier attack. However, unexpectedly, Amanda stopped mid-step, and turned. Uh-oh, Myron said, freezing instantly as their eyes met, as almost immediately, a bright and innocent smile appeared on his face, as though nothing bad had happened. Good book, he murmured softly, as he gently patted the cover before leaning forward and placing a kiss on it, before then pulling it into a tight hug, as Amanda stared at him for a long second. Hopeless, just like his father, she muttered quietly, as she turned and walked away once more, leaving Myron alone to deal with his anger issues. Chapter 1090 Catalyst. Meanwhile, in the wider universe, the Great Clan Gods. The failed attempt to assassinate Morris weighed heavily on the Great Clan Gods, as it left them in a constant state of unease, as they felt uncertain of when the deceiver might choose to retaliate. On one hand, the attempt proved that Morris was no Soren, and that together they possessed enough strength to overwhelm him if necessary, even in the presence of an origin metal weapon. Yet on the other hand, Multhorak's brazen involvement, and the manner in which they ultimately chose to retreat, told a very different story. A story of how at their core, most of them were cowards despite being gods. And a story of how they had all grown overly reliant on the alliance to cover for their weaknesses, rather than they themselves growing stronger to make up for it. I don't get it. I used to be so fearless in my prime. I wasn't afraid of getting stabbed, or taking 20 enemies at once. So just when did I go from being that man to the coward that I am now? Mu Shen said to his wife after the fight, as for the first time in a long time, he returned to training after the events at Helion 6, as a dormant desire to grow stronger and refine his abilities stirred within him. I need to become my own man again, Maggie. I need to become Mu Shen again, he said, as he spoke with ironclad resolve. However, he wasn't alone in this realization, as across the great clans, almost all other gods felt the same way as him. Many of them had not realized it before, however, back when they were still mortals chasing immortality, many of them had drastically different personalities to those that they had now, and the reason behind it was more complex than what a common man could easily decipher. As mortals chasing immortality, they had once been something entirely different, as they were hungry, ruthless individuals for whom growing stronger was not a matter of ambition, but survival. Back then, the universe had not been a place of order. It had been a battlefield. A world where one either stood at the top as a predator, or fell beneath it as prey, as every step forward demanded blood, sacrifice, and an unyielding will to dominate. They had lived in that world, thrived in it, because in those days, hesitation meant death, and weakness invited extinction, as only those with the courage to seize power could carve out a place for themselves. And when they finally rose, when they broke past mortality and ascended into godhood, their personalities had not changed overnight. As for a time, they remained the same men who had clawed their way up from nothing. They took revenge, settled old grudges, crushed those who had once stood above them, until eventually, there was nothing left. No enemies worth pursuing, no goals left unfinished, no chains tying them to the past. And once everything that once drove them had been fulfilled, the fire that had once burned within them began to change. Because now, there was nothing left to chase. No higher realm to ascend to. No greater enemy to overcome. And so, their mindset shifted. From gaining power, to preserving it. And that was the moment they began to lose their balls. Because once the fear of death disappeared, and the hunger for growth faded alongside it, what replaced it was something far more insidious. Comfort, security, the desire to hold on to what they had built, rather than risk it all for something greater. Which was why the Great Clan Alliance was formed. 6 god-backed clans, bound together, watching each other's backs. As in doing so, they removed the chaos that once defined their existence, and replaced it with a structured safety that ensured none of them had to stand alone again. At the time, it seemed like the smartest decision. With the timeless assassin hunting gods in an era of unchecked violence, unity had been survival, as standing together meant none of them could be picked off so easily. And then, when the timeless assassin fell, that unity evolved into submission. Because instead of rising to fill the vacuum left behind, they chose the safer path. They bowed to Morris, to Helmuth, to Caliph. They became vassals to the universal government, trading independence for stability, as in doing so, they bought themselves 2.5 millennia of uninterrupted peace. However, unbeknownst to them, in those millennia, something within them quietly died, because peace dulled their instincts. Comfort weakened their resolve, and without war to sharpen their edge, the ferocity that had once defined them began to fade into something unrecognizable. They stopped fighting, stopped risking, stopped growing, until eventually, when danger appeared once more, their first instinct was no longer to confront it, but to avoid it, to retreat, to survive, which was why, when Multhorak arrived, almost none of them had the conviction to stand their ground, as instead of meeting him head-on, they searched for escape, as though that had always been who they were. As though they had always been such cowards. However, only they knew, they hadn't. Because once they returned to safety, once the immediate danger passed, once they were left alone with their thoughts, that realization hit them all the same. This was not who they were. This was not the attitude that had supported them on their way to godhood, and that the current them had no balls. Because the old them would never tolerate such cowardice from anyone. The edge I have lost must be regained, Yukiro said to himself after retreating, because just like Mu Shen, he too understood that cowards could run, cowards could hide, however, cowards could never win. Because, history was never written by those who chose safety. It was written by those who stepped forward when others stepped Back, as in an era where the universe was beginning to turn chaotic once more, the question was no longer whether conflict would come, but rather who would rise to meet it when it did. Because the wheel had begun to turn again. And if they wished to remain relevant in the era that was about to unfold, then they needed to find their balls again. Or be reduced to nothing more than legends of a forgotten age. Chapter 1091 The Rowdy Dragons. Meanwhile, planet Draconia, within Molthorak's royal court. In the weeks following Molthorak's return from his clash against the other gods, the dragon court had grown even more brazen and primordial than before, as whatever thin restraint had once existed within its halls now seemed to have completely vanished. The dragons gathered within no longer made even the slightest effort to mimic civility, as they sprawled openly across the chamber while feasting on half-cooked carcasses, drinking blood wine in excess, and roaring their approval or displeasure without regard for order. As the atmosphere felt heavier now, wilder, as though the court itself had reverted into something closer to its ancient roots, where strength alone dictated value, and where cruelty was not hidden behind ceremony but rather displayed openly as a form of entertainment. Today, in the center of that chaos stood a single human entertainer, trembling as he sang before the court, his voice cracking despite his desperate attempts to remain composed, as he understood all too well that his performance was not being judged for art, but for survival. The song itself was meaningless to the dragons. It was not the melody they wanted, nor the pitch that felt inherently pleasing to their ears. And yet, they led him on, encouraging him from time to time, only to pull the rug from under him and suddenly changing that encouragement into heckling, as they tried to throw his rhythm off. Sing louder or I'll kill you. What is this nonsense? Don't you know any songs that praise the king? Sing those. Your voice hurts my ears, shut up. The dragons jeered from all sides, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus of mockery and threat, as the trembling human struggled to keep his voice steady while forcing the final verse out of his throat. For the dragons, this was never about music. It was about control. About the thrill of deciding whether a lesser being would walk out alive, or be reduced to ash for their amusement, as whistles, laughter, and cruel taunts echoed through the chamber without restraint. At the far end of the chamber, seated upon a throne carved from bones, Molthorak watched the performance with an unreadable look on his face, his massive frame leaning slightly to one side while his golden eyes remained fixed on the human like a predator watching a trapped animal. Then, once the song was over, the chamber quieted just enough for him to render judgment. His now scaly hand rose slowly into the air. The court held its breath. Then Molthorak extended his thumb upward. The reaction from the dragons was immediate, as the entire court broke into loud, contemptuous boos, hissing and snarling in theatrical outrage while several dragons slapped their tails against the stone floor in protest, making the chamber tremble faintly from the force of it. Molthorak smiled. Then he lowered his thumb. And just like that, the mood of the court flipped entirely, as the same dragons who had booed a second before now erupted into cheers, roaring with savage delight while claws scraped against stone and wings flared wide in celebration. That was the signal. Dozens of dragons inhaled at once, their enormous chests swelling as heat built visibly behind their throats, before a wall of dragonfire descended upon the poor human in the center of the chamber, reducing him to ash so quickly that his scream barely had time to form. FWOOSH. Within an instant the human was gone, leaving behind only the delighted laughter of beasts who found genuine joy in cruelty, as Molthorak himself let out a satisfied grunt before shifting slightly on his throne. Send in the next entertainer, he said, his tone casual, as though he had merely finished tasting a forgettable snack rather than ordering a man's death for sport, as the court door opened for an instant. Creak. The crowd expected another entertainer to walk in, however, in place of another doomed performer, a court messenger entered instead, as the mood changed at once. The rowdy noise of the chamber dulled, as even the most barbaric among the dragons understood that a dragon court messenger needed to be heard with respect. As the newcomer advanced steadily through the center of the hall before dropping to one knee, his head lowered respectfully as the heat of the chamber and the weight of countless eyes settled over him. Kratos, Molthorak said, his gaze sharpening faintly, what news do you bring from the front lines? Have we conquered planet Extar, or have we failed? He asked, as Kratos bowed his head deeper. My lord, was failure ever an option under your command? He said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who knew the answer would please the court. Of course we won. Planet Extar has been taken away from the Rue clan and is now a part of your glorious dragon empire. For a brief second, the court remained frozen. Then it exploded. Roars shook the chamber from end to end as dragons slammed fists, tails, and weapons against the stone in triumph, while several of the younger ones spread their wings and bellowed so loudly that dust rained from the ceiling above. Multharic nodded slowly from his throne, a satisfied smile spreading across his face as he listened to the celebration unfold before him, the sound of victory clearly pleasing him more than the pathetic death of the human singer ever could. Very good, Multharic said, once the noise had subsided enough for his voice to carry. Tell the men who fought on Extar that there will be a massive feast organized for them when they return to Draconia. Tell them I am proud of them. That declaration sent the room into celebration once more, as the promise of feast, reward, and royal recognition only elevated the victory in the eyes of those gathered, while Kratos remained bowed with satisfaction written plainly across his face. Soon after, the court began breaking into smaller conversations, as groups of dragons leaned toward one another and spoke with growing confidence, their voices thick with the arrogance that had returned to them ever since Multharic reclaimed his throne. These human-occupied planets are far easier to conquer than I expected, one courtier said, his jaws curling into something between a grin and a sneer. Once you take out their aircraft and their anti-dragon missiles, the rest of them fight like frightened cattle. Another nodded in agreement, as he dug a claw into the armrest of his seat while speaking with utter conviction. Exactly. Strip away the machines and the technology, and what remains is weak flesh. We can tear through them, burn through them, and eat them alive if we wish. A third dragon leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with savage excitement. Once our own technology develops further, and once the king's campaigns continue at this pace, we will become the rulers of the universe again. I do not doubt it for even a second. Of course we will, another replied immediately, raising his cup high into the air. Our true king has returned. Under Lord Multharic, the dragons will spread their wings again. That sentiment spread quickly across the room, repeated in one form or another by nearly every dragon present, as what had once only been cautious hope had now transformed into belief. And belief, in the hands of creatures like these, was a dangerous thing. After all, it had only been a few months since Multharac's return. And yet, in that short span of time, the dragons had already captured 6 planets, maintaining an average conquest rate of 1 planet every month, which had filled the remnants of their race with more momentum than they had felt in millennia. The surviving dragons now believed the age of decline was ending. They believed the old humiliation was being washed away with blood and fire. They believed that the winds of change were once again gathering beneath their wings. And as a result, they were beginning to dream about universal domination again. Chapter 1092 The New Hope. 1 month later, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. For 1 full month after his breakthrough, Leo devoted himself to understanding the true limits of his new strength, as every passing day revealed another layer to what becoming a demigod had actually changed within him. During this time, he pushed both his physical endurance and his understanding of the laws of the universe to their limits, as he attempted to adapt to the new force that he had now gained access to in the form of divine essence. However, even as he continued down that path in isolation, refining his control and deepening his grasp over the principles he had studied for so long but never practiced, his thoughts never strayed too far from what lay ahead. Because the next phase had already begun to take shape inside his head. Once the tournament to determine the cult's strongest monarchs was over, the cult army was to no longer remain dormant within the time-stilled world, as Leo now intended to lead them back into the wider universe and begin a new era of conquest under his command. This time, however, the scale was to be different. Because now, with him standing at the demigod realm, the cult no longer needed to scheme and hide in the shadows as cautiously as before, as it finally possessed the kind of strength that could begin shaping the wider universe directly. Yet even with that power, Leo understood that one crucial piece was still missing. If he truly wished to stand against gods while remaining 1 full tier below them, then his next objective was already clear, as he needed to invent a new fighting style rooted in his understanding of the laws of. It stood as one of the grandest structures built within the time-stilled world in recent memory, a colossal circular colosseum forged from reinforced divine alloys and layered enchantments, with a seating capacity of 500,000 spectators. And on the day of its inauguration, every single seat was filled. From the highest terraces to the innermost rows nearest the fighting grounds, the arena overflowed with anticipation, as the people of the cult gathered not only to witness battle, but to witness the beginning of a new era. When Leo arrived, the atmosphere changed immediately. A wave of sound rolled across the arena like a living force, as hundreds of thousands of voices rose together in overwhelming welcome, their cheers echoing against the walls with a near-religious intensity that was impossible to ignore. Leo descended calmly into the center of the arena floor, dressed simply yet carrying himself with a composure that now came far more naturally than it once did, as the weight of so many eyes no longer made him feel uneasy. One by one, the contestants approached him. And one by one, Leo shook each of their hands personally, offering every fighter the same measured nod and the same wish for good fortune, as he treated them not merely as subordinates but as warriors who had earned the right to stand here. Leonardo was among them, and so was Ver, still disguised beneath the identity of Commander Sparrow, his expression composed as he met Leo's eyes briefly before moving along without drawing attention to himself. Leo greeted them both the same as he did the others. Fairly, openly, and without any blatant favoritism. Once the formal greetings were over, Leo turned toward the stands and raised a hand to the crowd, as the response that followed surged through the arena like a tidal wave, loud enough to make even the reinforced structure hum faintly under its weight. As he looked around at the sea of faces rising in every direction, filled with admiration, reverence, and unshaken belief, Leo felt a strange sense of familiarity settle within him. He had seen those eyes before. Not just once or twice, but many times in the past, as that was the same gaze that people once gave Soren, and as he stood there now, he could not help but recall the past, where he was a contestant and Soren the cult master. Leo still remembered the Sir Lewis Hamilton arena clearly, the day he and Ver fought to determine who would be crowned the cult's dragon, as the entire atmosphere of that event had shifted the moment Soren stepped into the arena personally. The crowd had erupted, not in celebration of the fight, nor in anticipation of the outcome, but rather in response to Soren alone. Their cheers had reached a fever pitch that day, a level of intensity that not even the crowning of the new dragon could match. As for them, the result of the battle had mattered less than the presence of the man they worshipped. Because to them, Soren had not just been a leader. He had been their god, their messiah, their everything. And now, as Leo stood there, looking into those same kinds of eyes once again, he understood that nothing about that feeling had changed. Only the person at the center of it had, as those eyes were no longer turned toward Soren, they were turned toward him. The same reverence, the same belief. And yet, it was for him now. Sigh. Leo exhaled slowly, as the weight of that realization settled over him in full. Because now, he was the cult master. Now, he was the one they looked to. Now, he was their hope, their future. And while it was a humbling experience, it was also a burden. A burden that would have once made him uneasy back when he was still a monarch. But that fear was gone now. Somewhere between Granada, the breakthrough, and the month that followed, something inside him had changed, as he no longer felt like a man pretending to carry the future of the cult. As instead, he felt like someone who truly could. So as the cheers of the arena continued to crash against him from all sides, Leo lifted his chin slightly and looked out across the crowd with steady eyes, no longer shrinking from their faith, no longer fearing the expectations placed upon him. His shoulders were broad enough to bear it now, and for the first time, he knew that with absolute certainty. Step, step. With calm, deliberate strides, Leo ascended toward the elevated seat. Prepared for him, his presence alone commanding silence as the roar of the crowd gradually settled into an anticipatory hush. He did not rush. Each step was steady, each movement precise, as the countless eyes fixed upon him followed his ascent, their expectations rising in tandem with his approach. Reaching the top, he turned once more to face the arena in its entirety, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of spectators and contestants alike before finally lowering himself onto the seat reserved for the cult master. For a brief moment, he simply sat there, unmoving, as the weight of his position, his authority, and his presence settled firmly into the atmosphere of the arena itself. Then, he raised his hand, and said, "The tournament to crown the cult's strongest commanders starts. Now, may the best warrior win. And may he then go on to become a demigod that the cult can rely on. I, Cult Master Leo, now declare this grand tournament open," Leo said, as his voice boomed across the arena as the silence shattered once more, 500,000 spectators erupting in unison, as their voices crashed together in anticipation for the first clash. Chapter 1093 The Cult Monarchs. Within the Lord Soren arena, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. From his elevated seat overlooking the arena, Leo observed every match unfolding beneath him with great amusement. Every single participant seemed to have trained extremely hard for this tournament, which was why the fighting was intense and the matches entertaining, as everyone seemed to be giving it their all to move on to the next round. However, although they were all monarchs at the same tier, it became obvious right from the early rounds that Leonardo, Commander Silva, Ver, and Dupravel were four fighters on a completely different level than the rest. As while their opponents gave everything they had in the opening round, the four of them held back a significant portion of their strength and still advanced without difficulty. That outcome did not surprise Leo. However, what did catch his attention was the overwhelming crowd support Ver received the moment he entered the arena, as among all the commanders, Commander Sparrow stood out as a clear favorite. From the instant he stepped onto the battlefield, the atmosphere shifted noticeably, as the audience responded with an intensity that even surpassed the reception given to the more established veterans. Which was proof that Commander Sparrow had, over the years, earned that response quietly, as his humility, discipline, and consistency had won him the genuine support of the people without him ever needing to demand it, which now translated into roaring cheers the moment he took the field. Leo observed it with a thoughtful gaze, as beyond the spectacle of the moment, he understood the deeper implication behind it, as this level of acceptance was exactly what was needed for someone who was the cult's dragon. As this was going to make it far easier for Leo to someday reveal that Commander Sparrow was Aegon Vare to the masses down the line. He's worked hard to redeem himself after being captured, Leo muttered, as being satisfied with Vare's progress, he shifted his attention toward the next match, where Leonardo took the stage. From the moment the fight began, the difference in his style became immediately apparent, as unlike most monarchs who favored aggressive exchanges and prioritized offense, Leonardo approached combat with a level of control that stood apart from the rest. With a sword in one hand and a shield in the other, his movements were measured and deliberate, as he did not rush to overwhelm his opponent but instead focused on maintaining balance throughout the fight. It restricted his mobility to a degree. However, in return, it granted him a defensive structure that proved incredibly difficult to break, as every incoming strike was either absorbed cleanly or redirected with minimal effort. Leo watched intently, and as the exchanges unfolded, he found even his own eyes struggling to identify clear openings in Leonardo's defense, as the discipline behind his movements ensured that he never overextended or left himself exposed unnecessarily. Where other monarchs accepted damage as part of their offense, Leonardo minimized it entirely, as across the duration of the match, he took almost no meaningful hits despite facing a capable opponent. That's it, big cousin. Show him what it feels like. Don't let him breathe. Finish it. The voices rang out loudly from within the crowd, cutting through the noise of the arena with surprising clarity, as Leo's gaze shifted instinctively toward their source. Even among 500,000 spectators, he found them instantly. Caleb and Myron sat buried within the stands, their appearances altered neatly through shapeshift, their facial features blended well enough to fool any ordinary observer. Yet their disguise was incomplete. Leo let out a quiet sigh as he watched them lean forward in excitement, shouting without restraint, their voices carrying a familiar pitch that stood out to him effortlessly despite the overwhelming noise around them. They got the faces right, he thought, his gaze narrowing slightly. But the voices, not even close. At his current level, he did not need to see them clearly to know it was them, as even the slightest fluctuation in tone was enough for him to identify them without hesitation. Still a long way to go, he muttered under his breath, before returning his attention to the fighting below, as a few minutes later, Leonardo won. Further into the tournament, the much-anticipated clash between Dupraval Nuna and Darnell Nuna drew the full attention of the arena, as the father and son stepped onto the battlefield under an atmosphere thick with expectation. Leo leaned forward slightly as the fight began, as based on experience alone, he found himself favoring Dupraval to come out on top. However, the outcome unfolded differently. Darnell fought with sharper execution and greater decisiveness, as he maintained constant pressure while denying his father the space needed to dictate the flow of the fight. The exchanges were tight and intense, yet over time, the younger fighter's pace began to tilt the balance in his favor, as he adapted quicker and committed more cleanly to each opportunity. In the end, it was Darnell who secured the victory, much to Leo's surprise, as the result settled into a deeply satisfying moment for everyone present in the arena. Having witnessed Darnell's growth over the years with his own eyes, Leo felt a quiet sense of pride rise within him, as seeing that journey culminate in a moment like this carried genuine weight. The spoiled arrogance that once defined him had long since faded, replaced by discipline and purpose, as he had steadily carved out his place within the cult through effort rather than privilege, earning both respect and recognition the right way. As even Dupraval seemed more proud than disappointed, as he laughed and hugged his son after the fight, in a moment that was cheered by all. Lastly, it was Commander Anderson Silva who made his way to the semi-finals, as he won his fights with overwhelming dominance to lock out the final two fights. Commander Sparrow vs Commander Anderson Silva, while Leonardo took on Darnell Nuna, to decide the final two winners. Who would receive the demigod breakthrough potions? Chapter 1094 Tournament Conclusion. Within the Lord Sorin Arena, the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. The semi-finals of the tournament unfolded under an atmosphere thick with anticipation, as the demigod breakthrough potions were directly in play now. The first match between Commander Sparrow and Commander Anderson Silva quickly escalated into one of the highest levels of combat Leo had witnessed in a long time, as both fighters edged out the other in different aspects. From the very first exchange, the intensity was evident, as Silva's overwhelming aggression met Ver's clinical precision, their strikes colliding with force that sent shockwaves rippling across the arena floor. They traded blows relentlessly, each reading the other's movements with sharp awareness, while traps were laid and countered in quick succession, as neither allowed themselves to fall behind for long. Moments arose where Silva seemed to seize control of the fight, pressing forward with dominating momentum that forced Ver into increasingly tight positions, as even Leo felt that the match might slip away from him. Yet every time the balance tipped, Ver found a way to recover, slipping out of danger through sheer skill and awareness, as he adapted continuously without ever relying on the forbidden cult techniques that would have revealed his identity. Despite a large portion of his skills locked away, he still fought on equal footing, adjusting his rhythm and striking with calculated bursts that gradually chipped away at Silva's control. The fight carried everything one could expect from two champions of the cult, as intelligence, power, timing, and resolve all collided in a battle that held the entire arena captive. As it was not until the very final exchange that Ver edged ahead, finding a narrow opening that he exploited cleanly, as he ended the fight with precision to incapacitate Silva. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Then the arena erupted. Leo rose to his feet without thinking, his hands coming together in a firm clap as he gave Ver a standing ovation, recognizing not just the victory, but the journey that led to it. "He's come a long way," Leo murmured under his breath, as in that moment, it felt as though Ver's redemption had finally reached its conclusion, and more importantly, had led him to claim the first demigod potion, which was crucial for his future growth. Soon, it was time for the second semi-final, as Leonardo stepped onto the field next to face Darnell Nuna. From the outset, Darnell pushed forward aggressively, attempting to break through Leonardo's defense with relentless pressure, as he sought to force mistakes through speed and intensity. However, Leonardo responded with composure, maintaining his structure while absorbing and redirecting every incoming strike, as his shield work remained consistent throughout the exchanges. The fight unfolded with sharp precision, as Darnell searched constantly for openings, adjusting his approach repeatedly while attempting to find a weakness within Leonardo's defense. Yet no matter how the exchanges shifted, Leonardo held firm, controlling the pace of the fight while minimizing damage, as his approach gradually wore down his opponent's momentum. In the end, the difference became clear. Leonardo's discipline proved too much to overcome. He secured the victory cleanly, as the moment the result was declared, his composure broke, and emotion surged through him all at once. Tears streamed down his face as he raised his sword toward Leo, his expression filled with relief and pride before he bowed deeply in respect. Leo clapped for him from above, his expression calm, as he acknowledged the victory, and yet, he did not give a standing ovation to Leonardo like he did to Ver, simply because the battle was not that close. Regardless, with both winners decided, the tournament had effectively reached its conclusion, as the final match was announced as an exhibition between Sparrow and Leonardo. The tone of the arena shifted slightly, as the pressure eased and the fighters approached the match with a lighter mindset, understanding that no real stakes remained, with their exchange reflecting that, as they fought with control and restraint, testing one another without pushing toward injury, as the match became more of a display of skill than a contest of dominance. In the end, Sparrow stepped back and conceded, allowing Leonardo to be declared the overall winner of the tournament, as the crowd responded with loud approval. Once the formalities concluded, Leo descended to the arena floor. Once more, carrying the two breakthrough potions in his hands as the noise of the crowd swelled once again. He handed one to Sparrow. Then the other to Leonardo. "Do your best to break through," he said simply, as his voice carried clearly despite its calm tone, the weight of expectation settling naturally within his words. Both fighters accepted their rewards with visible determination, understanding the significance of what had just been entrusted to them. The crowd began to settle after that, many believing the event had reached its end, as the energy within the arena started to shift toward closure. However, Leo stepped forward once more. Standing at the center of the arena, he raised his hand slightly, drawing the attention of 500,000 spectators back toward him in an instant. "Today was a good day, no?" he asked, his voice carrying easily across the vast structure, as a wave of cheers answered him immediately. "You think our cult commanders are capable?" he continued, his tone rising slightly as he gestured toward the contestants. "Watching our commanders fight, do you feel like they are men worth rallying behind?" The response came like thunder. The crowd roared in unison, their voices filled with conviction as the energy surged once again. Leo's expression shifted, the casualness in his tone fading, as something heavier took its place. "Then the time for waiting is coming to an end," he said, his voice lowering slightly as it carried a new weight that silenced the arena. Once more. Soon, Mass mobilization begins, he continued, his gaze sweeping across the crowd as every word settled deeply within them. And this time, we won't stop until we take back what's ours. The air itself felt different now. Charged. Serious. We have suffered for too long, Leo said, his tone firm as the conviction behind his words became undeniable. But this time, for sure, the cult will strike back. Silence followed, not from lack of reaction, but from the sheer weight of what had just been said. And in that silence, every single person present understood the same thing. Something big was coming, and Leo was leading that charge. Chapter 1095A9 Suspicion. Planet V Star, Leo's POV. After the tournament concluded, the first visit that Leo made was to Planet V Star, to consult with the projection of the timeless assassin, as he wanted advice from the old man on how best to forge a new fighting style. You want to learn the secret behind my second's walk? The timeless assassin's projection asked, as it stroked its long beard, and shook its head. No offense, cult master, but you already know all there is to know about how to perform the second's walk. The second's walk is an application combining your knowledge about the law of time, law of space and law of creation and destruction. It's not a novel concept. It's not a skill move per se. The projection explained, as it scratched its head as though baffled on how best to explain it. You see, the second's walk I did, was very different from what my son Soren learned. And that's because it's not exactly a skill move with a set framework. You see, I can teach you how to stab. I can teach you how to spin. Hell, I can even teach you how to weave. However, that's all I can do. I can't teach you how to stab, weave and spin in a battlefield full of opponents to kill them and keep moving forward, as that application is something innate. What you're asking of me, is to pass down my intellect, and that's not possible. You must develop your own version of the second's walk. You've seen how it works. Now, the challenge is to recreate it in your own image. The projection explained, as Leo nodded in understanding. So in the end, learning second's walk comes down to talent. Those who are not talented enough, might never grasp it. Just like how within sports teams, even though the entire team trains, eats and sleeps together, there are a few who perform at a level much higher to others due to innate talent. Correct, Leo asked, as the timeless assassin's projection hummed in agreement. And how long do you think it will take me to grasp this concept? Leo inquired, as the projection stroked its beard thoughtfully with one hand, while the other turned slowly, palm open, as if weighing the certainty of the answer he was about to give. It depends on what you're trying to create. With your talent, if you just want to replicate the second's walk alone, maybe a few months to a couple years. However, if you're trying to create something even greater, something that not even I created, then maybe up to a decade. Who knows? Depends entirely on what you're trying to create. Because the concepts needed to make something so grand, you have grasped already. The projection explained, as Leo let out a long sigh in response. He had come here today, hoping for some guidance on how to create this new fighting style faster. And yet, he got no usable answers that could help speed up his process. Regardless, he at least received the clarity that he needed on how to proceed, and that alone was enough to keep him motivated for now. Meanwhile Caliph, after the failure to kill Morris on planet Helion 6, Caliph felt as though everything around him was unraveling in a way that he could not control, as for the first time in a long time, he felt depressed beyond salvation, as though he was no longer in the driver's seat of his own life. Almost nothing unfolded the way he intended anymore, as outcomes slipped from his grasp one after another, leaving behind a quiet frustration that lingered beneath his otherwise composed exterior. And to make matters worse, every time he woke after resting his eyes for an extended period, the blindness that plagued him lingered just a little longer than before, as darkness clung stubbornly to his vision. Before slowly receding, it was subtle, gradual, yet impossible to ignore. Each passing day made it clearer that something within him was deteriorating, as the consequences of past battles and unseen damage began to surface in ways he could not fully control. Clench. Caliph tightened his fist slowly, as the memory of Helion 6 surfaced with sharp clarity, the humiliation he endured there refusing to fade no matter how much time passed. Morris, Multheric, two names that now weighed heavily on his mind. The failed assassination had done more than just expose their limitations, as it had shifted the balance of power in a way that left him vulnerable to retaliation. Morris was not the type to let such an attempt go unanswered, and that uncertainty gnawed at him every day. He did not know when it would come, or how, yet he knew it would, which made every passing moment feel like borrowed time. At the same time, the rage he felt toward Multheric burned even hotter, as the dragon god's interference had not only disrupted their plan, but had left Caliph in a position he had never experienced before. Helpless, outmatched, forced to retreat. That memory lingered like a stain on his pride, as the desire to tear Multheric down with his own hands grew stronger with each passing day. Until both of them were dead, he would not know peace. That much was certain. Yet even as these thoughts occupied his mind, there was another presence that refused to leave his awareness entirely. Leo Skyshard, and the cult. He had no concrete information about their current movements, as their silence only made them harder to track and predict. And yet, despite that lack of information, something within him remained uneasy whenever he thought of them. A quiet instinct within him constantly warned that the chapter surrounding Leo Skyshard was not over just yet. That someday, he would return with the full wrath of the cult behind his back. However, Caliph did not allow that thought to consume him entirely. As he understood that there were priorities that demanded his attention first. Leo was still a mortal. A growing threat, yes, but not the one that would decide his fate in the immediate future. As before that, he had to deal with those who stood on equal footing with him first. Morris, Multheric, the Immortals. As only after dealing with them could he afford to turn his full attention towards an ant like the cult. Chapter 1096 War Council. Within the time-stilled world, Leo's POV. A week after the conclusion of the tournament, Leo convened the first War Council in a long time, as he gathered all the cult commanders under one roof and began outlining his plans for the next phase of conquest. "We need to begin planning for a phased expansion," Leo said, his voice steady as he addressed the room. "According to internal records, we have lost close to 1.5 million capable fighters over the past 2 decades to natural causes alone." He paused briefly, letting the weight of that number settle. As beneficial as the time-stilled world is for our safety and long-term stability, the reality remains that our people age significantly faster here compared to the outside universe, as many of our soldiers live out their entire lives training, only to die without ever seeing real combat. A quiet tension spread across the room as several commanders lowered their gaze. "Many of you have already raised concerns about declining morale," Leo continued, his eyes sweeping across the gathered leaders. "Our soldiers dedicate their lives to becoming warriors, yet most never get the chance to prove themselves on the battlefield." He let out a slow breath. "So, it's time we change that." The shift in tone was immediate. "We begin with our most experienced forces. The oldest soldiers, the veterans who have spent decades preparing for war, and those who desire nothing more than to finally fight. We deploy them first, and let them live out their dreams." Leo straightened slightly as he continued. "From the start of next calendar year, we will begin taking one new planet every 120 days. Within the time-stilled world, this pace will remain controlled and sustainable." His gaze sharpened. "However, from the perspective of the outside universe, it will appear as though the cult is launching a new invasion every other day." A murmur rippled through the room. "That means 3 planets every year. A steady, consistent expansion that we can sustain over the long term." Leo paused again, then delivered the number plainly. "By the end of this decade, I intend to bring 30 new planets under cult control." The room fell silent. 30 planets. Commander Silva thought, his expression tightening slightly. "That's more than what we held even during Lord Soren's era. I made a promise to our people," Leo continued, his voice growing firmer. "By the end of this century, the cult will control half of the Rainbow Stream." He held their gaze without wavering. "And I intend to keep that promise." A faint pressure filled the room as his presence settled over them. "At the demigod tier, I now possess the strength required to defend our territories against hostile gods, and unlike Lord Soren, I am not racing against a failing body." No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. "However, I cannot achieve this alone." Leo's tone lowered slightly, though the weight behind his words only deepened. "For the cult to rise again, for us to reclaim what was lost, I need every one of you to operate at your absolute peak over the next decade." His eyes hardened. "You will not have the luxury of rest. Most of you will be deployed continuously, moving from one battlefield to the next without pause." A beat passed. "Your lives will be difficult." Then, more quietly, "But if we endure, we will reclaim the pride that generations before us bled for," Leo said, his words settling into the room as the atmosphere hardened with resolve, the hesitation within the commanders replaced by something far more focused and unyielding, as silence held for a brief moment before. "Lord Father, if I may interrupt." Dumpy spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness as all eyes turned toward him, his expression already burning with impatience. "I think we have talked about war for far too long," he continued, as he rose to his feet, his presence carrying a raw intensity that demanded attention. "Talk is cheap. Deploy me tomorrow, and I will win you a dozen planets before 100 days pass." A faint grin spread across his face. "I do not even need an army. Just give me the freedom to act, and I will show you just how puny and insignificant righteous mongrels are. In front of me, the sheer confidence in his words sent a ripple through the room. Fists clenched, eyes sharpened. Same with me, Cult Master, Mickey James said, standing up next, his voice firm as he raised his fist high. Give me and my unit the freedom to act, and we will deliver results ahead of your timeline. Same for me, Cult Master, Anderson Silva added, rising shortly after, his tone steady, yet filled with conviction. I am ready for deployment. At any moment. One voice became many. Me too, my lord. I am ready. Deploy us. Commander after commander rose to their feet, their voices overlapping as the room filled with a unified surge of determination, as what began as a council had now turned into a declaration of war. Leo looked around, and for the first time in a long time, he saw no doubt or hesitation in the eyes of a single man. Instead, there was only resolve, as everyone seemed ready for war. Good, he muttered, nodding slowly, as a quiet sense of satisfaction settled within him as he let the moment breathe before raising his hand for silence once more. It came instantly. 1 year, Leo said, his voice calm, yet carrying absolute authority. Take 1 year to prepare everything you need. Logistics, weapons, ships, fuel, mana crystals. I want every detail accounted for, every weakness addressed, and every unit ready for sustained war. His gaze hardened, because once that year ends, there will be no pauses. The weight behind those words settled deeply into the room. We move forward without stopping. And we take back everything that belongs to us. Leo finished, as the silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding. The countdown to the redemption war had finally begun. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.